Hello and welcome to this episode of Happy Baking. Though in this episode, we're not actually baking anything, but we are making a dough, so I think it counts. I'm making a delicious recipe from my cookbook, Savory Baking. We'll be making pierogi. Pierogi are supremely tasty filled dumplings made with a soft, tender, enriched dough. They can be filled with a variety of different fillings, and they're actually super easy to shape. First, pierogi are boiled to help make them tender and cook them through. Then they are sautéed in a little bit of butter, which crisps up the outside and of course adds a little richness. They are an incredibly delicious recipe and they are so satisfying to make at home. So let's get pierogi-ing. If you've watched my channel before, you may notice that I'm not in my own kitchen. I decided to come to New York because one of my crew members recently became a new dad and needed to stay closer to his family. So one of my other crew members has graciously donated his house and kitchen, but there might be some food in it for him. So, there's a reason. Classic pierogi can be filled with things like mashed potatoes, cheese, meat, vegetables like spinach or cabbage, or even a combination of ingredients. Sweet pierogi can be filled with fruit or sweetened cheese like farmer's cheese or cottage cheese. But today I'm sticking with savory fillings and we're gonna make 3 different kinds of pierogi. We're gonna make a classic mashed potato pierogi with a little bit of cheese. We're gonna make a mushroom pierogi and one of my favorites, sauerkraut pierogi. Mashed potatoes is one of the most popular pierogi fillings, and it's also a great way to use up leftover mashed potatoes. It also pairs great with some of the other filling options, things like onions, sauerkraut, really anything you like. First, I'm gonna add the butter to the pan, melt it, and then I'm gonna cook some onions in it. I wanna get them a little bit caramelized with a nice golden color. Next, I'll cover the potatoes with water by at least 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters and bring it to a boil. Once it's boiling, I want to cook the potatoes until they are fork tender so they can be easily mashed. Once the potatoes are cooked, I'll drain them and mash them coarsely, then mix in some of the other ingredients. To my potato filling, I like to add a little sour cream, the onions, and some sharp cheddar cheese. Oh, and some salt and pepper, of course. I'm gonna set the filling aside to cool because you don't want to build your pierogi with warm filling. So let's make our next filling. Mushrooms make for a wonderful savory pierogi filling, and I like to load mine up with a bunch of herbs for a little bit of punch. For the mushroom filling, I'll start by heating some oil in a skillet and cooking my onions in that oil. I just want to cook these onions until they get nice and translucent. For this filling, I want to chop the mushrooms super small. I usually do this by hand, but you could also do it in the food processor to make quick work of it. Next, I'll add some butter to the pan and add the mushrooms. First, I want to cook the mushrooms until they release all their moisture. Then I'll keep cooking until they're well browned and really cooked down. Next, I'll add all the herbs in. I like to use parsley, sage, and thyme in my mushroom filling. Finally, I'll finish it off with a touch of heavy cream and a little bit of cream cheese, which makes this filling super rich and delicious. Once you've added those ingredients, you just want to simmer it long enough for the cream to reduce slightly so the filling thickens up. Then we'll set it aside to cool, just like our potato filling. Sauerkraut is often included in pierogi filling as just one of the components, alongside potato, mushrooms, or other ingredients. But my favorite kind of pierogi is a pure sauerkraut filling. Well, it's not totally pure. I do put some onions in it as well, but it's a boost of sauerkraut flavor. We'll start by draining the sauerkraut so it's nice and dry and isn't holding on to a lot of that moisture or brine. Next, I'll melt some butter in a pan and add my onions to it. I want to cook them until they're soft and translucent. Then I'll add the drained sauerkraut to it. If your sauerkraut is in big pieces, you might want to chop it a bit first. If it's pretty fine, you can just add it right into the pan. You'll cook it until the sauerkraut starts to wilt a little. I like to season my sauerkraut filling with salt and pepper and a little bit of whole grain mustard. That's the easiest filling of all to prepare. Maybe that's why it's my favorite one, but we'll set it aside to cool with our other fillings. Pierogi dough is simple to make, and it produces a soft, supple dough that's very easy to work with and shape. It's enriched with other ingredients like sour cream, egg, and melted butter, which also makes it extra delicious. To make the dough, in the bowl of a stand mixer fitted with the dough hook, mix the flour and salt on low speed to combine. You can also definitely mix this dough by hand in a large bowl using a spatula or wooden spoon. Add the sour cream, egg, and butter to the mixer and mix until a shaggy dough forms, about 3 minutes. If the dough seems dry or crumbly, you can add water about 5 grams or 1 teaspoon at a time until it comes together. But the dough shouldn't be sticky. Raise the speed to medium and continue to mix until the dough is fairly smooth, about 2 minutes more. Then, turn the dough out onto your work surface and divide it into 2 equal pieces. They'll be about 225 grams each. Form each one into a disc about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters thick, wrap it tightly in plastic wrap, and refrigerate it for at least 1 hour, or up to 2 days. Okay, it's time to shape the pierogi. Like all dumplings, there are many different ways to shape and seal pierogi. The traditional shaping method is to roll out the dough and cut it into rounds. The filling is placed inside the round of dough, and then the dough is folded over onto itself to create a half-moon shape. Here's how to do it. I'm gonna start by working with 1 piece of dough at a time. I'm gonna roll it out on a lightly floured surface to about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters thick. This is one of those times when you don't really need to worry about maintaining a perfect shape because we're gonna cut pierogi out of this dough. So you don't need to worry about keeping it perfectly round. If it gets a little square or rectangular on you, that's okay. Once I get this dough thin enough, I'm gonna use a 3¼ inch round cutter, about 8 centimeters. And if you don't have a cutter like this, you can also use the bottom of a glass that's about that size. And we're just gonna punch out the circles. And after I punch out this first one, I can save the scraps, and I'll save the scraps from both of the pieces of dough and re-roll them together. And you can just keep re-rolling as many times as you need, and you'll get about 18 circles when you're all done. Here's all my scrap dough. I'm just gonna knead it together a couple of times. It doesn't need to be perfect because it'll smooth out while we roll it. When you go to roll it out, if it springs back a lot, just wrap it up for a little while, toss it back in the fridge, let it relax for a few minutes, and it'll be easy to roll again in no time. Okay, I've made all my dough rounds, so now it's time to shape some pierogi. I did a few practice ones here because I always like to get in the rhythm of it, but it's so easy. The first thing I do is with my hands, I just stretch out each circle of dough just a little bit because it usually has relaxed a little bit since rolling and cutting it, just a little bit to thin it out a little more. Then I'm gonna take a heaping tablespoon, about 25 grams-ish of filling, and I'm gonna put it kind of towards one side of the dough. This is because we're gonna fold the other dough over it. So instead of putting it in the middle, I like to just kind of favor it to one side. Then I'll pick it up with my hands and I will just gently stretch the dough over. So I've encased the filling, and then I'm gonna pinch it really well. As you pinch it, you can also kind of work some of that filling out to the edge, and we'll just pinch to seal. Now, typically pierogi dough, because it's enriched, you don't need to use any water. If anything, you might need just a tiny bit of flour on your hands when you're pinching to make sure that it is sealing really well. If for some reason the dough is dry and it's not sealing for you, one of the things you can do is add just a touch of water with your fingertip just to help ensure that the dough is sticking together. And if for some reason you're having a hard time getting them to stay shut, you can also use the tines of a small fork just to help you really ensure that you get a nice seal and that none of that filling is gonna come out while you're boiling or sauteing them. So let's do another one. A little stretch of the dough. So I'm kind of gonna put my filling on one side of my half circle, and then I'll stretch the dough over and pinch it to seal. This time I'm kind of doing it on the tabletop. Sometimes holding it in your hand can feel kind of intimidating, so if it's easier, you can just stretch it over right on your work surface and then pinch. The one thing you wanna be sure of, and I actually made a little mistake right here, there's a little bit of an air pocket. Air pockets aren't that big of a deal, but an air pocket means a spot inside the dough where there is no filling, and it also makes it slightly more likely that it could open up while you're boiling or sauteing. So it's best to try to make sure when you fold it over that you minimize any air by just making it as tight as possible. Kind of the final step in the sealing is also to pinch that outer ends. Remember that that dough has become doubly thick because you've taken 2 1/8" 3mm pieces of dough and put them together. So now it's more like a 1/4 inch or 6mm. So pinching it a little bit at the edges will elongate those edges and also thin them out a little bit so that you don't have a bunch of kind of chunky dough right at the edge. So I'm gonna keep shaping until I get all the pierogi shaped. And in fact, because I've made 3 types of fillings, I've got quite a few to shape. So here comes a marathon shaping sesh. Here's a great make-ahead tip. Pierogi freeze beautifully. When you place them on the parchment-lined baking sheet, just make sure that none of the pieces of pierogi touch each other. Then transfer them to the freezer and freeze them until firm, 1 to 2 hours. Then transfer the frozen pierogi to an airtight storage container or zip-top bag. They'll keep in the freezer for up to 2 months. Okay, it's time to cook the pierogi. One of the most delicious parts of pierogi are the layers of texture. The chewiness in the dough comes from boiling them. And then when the pierogi are sautéed, they gain additional browning and a little bit of crispness. This, combined with the soft interior filling and possibly other textures like meltiness from cheese, creaminess from other ingredients, and whatever else you have in your filling, it just takes them over the top. First, let's boil our pierogi. Bring a large pot of water to a boil over high heat. Working in batches, add a few pierogi at a time to the water. First, they'll sink to the bottom briefly, and if you add too many at once, you can risk them sticking together at this point, so work with just a few at a time. Cook the pierogi until they float to the surface and the dough is cooked through, 4 to 5 minutes. Next, it's time to sauté them. In a large skillet, melt butter over medium heat. Add the well-drained pierogi to the pan and cook, turning once until they're lightly browned on both sides. If you're using any flavorful garnishes or inclusions, they're often added during the sautéing process. For my potato pierogi, I'm gonna add some caramelized onion. While pierogi are delicious all on their own, there are a few finishing touches that can take them totally over the top. The first is brown butter. Pierogi are typically sautéed in butter, but if you let the butter brown first, it adds a nutty flavor on the outside of each dumpling that I just love. Fresh herbs also make a great addition. They can be added at the beginning or end of sautéing. For example, I like to add sage leaves while I'm cooking. I add them to the butter and it really infuses their flavor in there. But something like chives I might add at the end to help retain its color and texture. One of my favorite finishes for pierogi is plenty of freshly cracked black pepper. So good. Many pierogi fillings contain onions, even caramelized onions, but I love adding some caramelized onions at the end when I'm sautéing my pierogi. It just really boosts the overall flavor and adds another texture into the mix. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Happy Baking, where we made so many pierogi, and off camera there are quite a few hungry people that are ready to eat said pierogi, so I'm gonna make this short and sweet. As always, all the recipes from this episode are linked in the video description below, and if you get inspired to make pierogi, please, please, please let me know in the comments or use #HappyBaking because I love to see what you're making in your kitchens. I'm gonna start by diving into some of these, but until next time, I'd like to wish you lots of happy baking or pierogi-ing. Got a little pierogi, I got some caramelized onion, got a little sour cream. It's all the textures. The dough is chewy and a little crispy. And inside there's the caramelized onions, which are sweet, the potatoes, which are starchy, and that sharp cheddar cheese makes it salty. I can't wait to eat each flavor of pierogi, and I can't wait to hear which ones you like best. Let me know in the comments.